God is Yahweh, and his story begins not in stately temples, but among wandering herders who no one thought would ever hold cosmic power. Let's tear into the darkest first chapter of how Yahweh became God. Here's the deal: Egyptian inscriptions from the reign of Amenhotep III, around 1400 BC, list among Pharaoh's conquests a region tagged as the land of the Shasu of YHW-H. That means the Egyptians identified a group of nomads, the Shasu, and tied them to the divine name YHW, which many scholars connect to Yahweh. Now hold on, this matters. It means the name Yahweh was floating around before the classical Israelite religion got written down. It means that a God we assume was central and pristine had roots in peripheral Bedouin-style cultures. Who were the Shasu? The term Shasu crops up in Egyptian records referring to nomads or wandering herdsmen in Transjordan, Edom, and southern Canaan, people on the margins of empire, not the palace halls. The phrase "land of the Shasu of YHW" does something mind-blowing. It attaches a specific divine name to them. Not land of the Shasu, but land of the Shasu of YHW. That suggests their identity was defined through worship of this god. The shift here is enormous, from tribes to deity. Pause and feel the drama. A god we use in liturgy emerges from the desert, tied to nomads, unpolished and raw. Not the grand temple at Jerusalem, not the codified scripture, but wandering people with flocks, in unexplored places. You suddenly realize monotheism didn't land fully formed, it was born in chaos, borders, wilderness. Let's look at the geography. These Shasu groups are tied to Edom, Seir, Teman, regions to Israel's southeast, not the heartland of Israel proper. Encyclopedias tell us that the oldest plausible occurrence of Yahweh's name is the Egyptian demonym TSWYHW, YHW in the land of the Shasu. So the picture forms: Yahweh starting life as a tribal deity of nomads, not the omnipotent creator we imagine. That's the first shock. Here's where the story turns darker. Once this god enters the orbit of a sedentary kingdom, major rewrites begin. Identity, authority, cult, everything gets flipped. But in this part, the origins are raw, uncompromising, borderline subversive to the idea that Yahweh always belonged to the chosen settled people. He didn't. He wandered with nomads. And that shakes the foundations of many orthodox narratives. Consider, if Yahweh was originally a god of nomadic herders, nomads who might have been marginalized, despised, viewed as lesser by neighboring kingdoms, then his elevation to the single god of a nation becomes a story of conquest, cultic, political, theological. The herder's god takes over the throne. The empire may change him, but his roots tell you he started in the wadi, in the open desert air. And evidence keeps punching. Multiple Egyptian texts list Shasu people distinctly, some with the tag of YHW. Scholars debate whether YHW is a place name, a deity name, or both. Doesn't matter for the power of the claim. The name exists in an extra-biblical context, at a date far earlier than many church traditions admit. A god once fringe. Think about the cultural import: nomadic religion, fluid pantheon, regional gods, everything that monotheism claims to stomp out. Yahweh's emergence is not from a clean zero monotheism point. It's messy, contested, intersectional. It's a power grab. Now, even more provocative, mainstream teaching often presents Yahweh as the timeless, global God, but here is proof he had a specific ethnic, geographic, cultural origin. He was part of a tribal identity, Shasu of YHW. That means worship of Yahweh began not in majestic grandeur but in humble, marginalized spaces. Then someone said, "This God belongs to us, and we will make him the God of all." That's dramatic. That's controversial. That's history-shaking doctrine. Watch this. The very label Shasu of YHW implies the nomads' distinctiveness. They were identified by their god. Other Shasu tribes were labeled by region, e.g., Shasu of SRR, Seir. But this one is of YHW. That intensifies the connection. Their patron deity defined them. So Yahweh played a role in identity formation even before Israel emerged as a nation. He was a rallying divine figure. And the twist? As Yahweh ascends, those nomadic roots are suppressed. The voices of the fringe fade. The God becomes national, centralized, untouchable. The desert preacher's God becomes Kingdom's League Club. The margins become the center, but traces of the margins linger like shadows. But let's not sugarcoat, the darkness in this origin is potent. A God attached to nomads means a God born in struggle, survival, mobility, conflict. These people had to fight for territory, identity, recognition. The God of wandering people had to assert himself. This isn't domesticated religion. This is raw, dangerous cultural ferment. Then, someone says, our God will rule them all. That's a takeover. And when you recognize this, the monotheistic claim there is only one God and all others untrue now takes on a violent dimension. The one God isn't just metaphysical, he has a history of absorbing, displacing, rewriting. That's the hidden story behind part 1. Yahweh didn't descend from heaven fully formed, he climbed up society's ladder, wrestled with other divine beings, and emerged victorious. A remote site on the frontier of Sinai, a crossroads of trade and pilgrimage, plastered walls, big clay jars, scribbles and drawings, unexpected whispers of cult behavior that mainstream theology rarely brings into the light. That site is Kentillet Ajrud, and what was found there slams open the doors on the notion that Yahweh was always a solitary, singular God in squeaky clean monotheism. Because here, inscriptions show Yahweh and his Asherah. Yes, his Asherah. That's not just a peripheral note, it hits the heart of what early worship looked like and what got suppressed. Think about what that means for 1 second. The phrase his Asherah implies a companion, partner, a divine feminine presence linked with Yahweh. At least that's how many scholars read it. The pot inscription found at Kentillet Ajrud reads something like, I bless you by Yahweh of Samaria and his Asherah. That is revoltingly provocative. Because the mainstream narrative you heard growing up is Yahweh, only Yahweh, one God. End of story. But the evidence says, maybe not quite so only. Now I can almost hear the gasps. Relax, they're justified. Because what this suggests is that the religion of ancient Israel wasn't yet monolithic. It was dynamic, it allowed divine couples, local variants, it tolerated a goddess figure alongside the big God. And then somewhere along the line, that goddess got removed from the scriptures, the cult, the official theology. Let's go deeper. The goddess in question is usually called Asherah. In Canaanite religion she was a big deal, mother goddess, sacred tree, symbol of fertility. And here, in these inscriptions, she's linked to Yahweh. At Khirbet Elkom, another frontier site, an inscription says, Blessed be Uriyahu by Yahweh. For from his enemies by his, Yahweh's, Asherah he saved him. That's explicit. Not by Yahweh alone but by Yahweh's Asherah. Some academics argue, maybe Asherah here means cult object, a sacred tree, a pole, rather than goddess. Fair. Others say the grammar, social context, and parallel cult practice indicate it's more than a wooden pole. The fact that the suffix his Asherah appears raises the possibility of a divine consort. And yes, I said consort. That's the direct challenge to the idea that Yahweh worship always excluded female divinity or other gods. Because here is bottom line, worshippers invoked Yahweh and Asherah together. Now for the raw reality, the site at Kentillet Ajrud dates to around late 9th to early 8th century BCE, a time when Israelite religion was still fluid, local shrines existed, cultic practices varied by region. The inscriptions and drawings at the jars show strange iconography, 2 bipedal figures flanking a sacred tree motif, inscriptions of Yahweh and his Asherah. Some scholars interpret those 2 figures as Yahweh and Asherah, others say male gods or symbolic figures. But whichever side you lean toward, you cannot deny that something other than the official monotheistic script was going on. Here's where it gets juicy. A goddess figure alongside Yahweh means the religion tolerated a divine plurality or at least duality at one point. Monotheism wasn't locked down yet. The narrative of only Yahweh, no other gods, no partners is a later theological move, an enforced revision. But the inscriptions scream, for some worshippers, Yahweh didn't stand alone. The suppression of the goddess suggests a theological cleansing over time. And guess what? The text doesn't trumpet that. Official canon leaves the goddess out. But the pots don't lie. Let me pull you into some specifics. On jar inscriptions, the phrase LYHWHHTMNWLRTH to Yahweh of Teman and his Asherah appears. The WLRTH means and his Asherah. That minor suffix is explosive. It implicitly recognizes the possession or association of the goddess with Yahweh. And the fact that this comes from a site on the edge, Sinai border, trade route, fringe of Judah, Israel, suggests religious practice at the margins was more eclectic, more syncretic. Then later on, the center consolidated, and that fringe variety got cleaned out. Now let's stir the pot. What if the official religion intentionally erased the goddess? The Bible repeatedly condemns Asherah poles and high places, and the Hebrew prophets decry worship of Asherah. Yet the archaeology shows that worship of Asherah, even associated with Yahweh, was real. That disconnect reveals a battle between popular religion and official theology, between local shrine practices and centralized cult. The temple priests and scribes may have said only Yahweh, but the people kept invoking Yahweh and Asherah. That's a power struggle in the divine economy. And don't pretend this was marginal or negligible. The volume of inscriptions at Cantilit at Ajrud is substantial, dozens of jars, plaster inscriptions, drawings. The site was active, full of visitors. The fact that someone wrote those inscriptions means they believed them enough to select Yahweh and his Asherah as a formula of blessing. That's lived religion, not just theoretical. If the rest of religious history were a tidy line from tribal deity to monotheistic God, this section is the dirty footnote someone tried to erase, but couldn't entirely. And you, watching this, should feel that shock. It's one thing to learn that religion evolves, it's another to find the clear ghost of a goddess beside the God many assume never had a partner. That forces you to reconceive what the ancient worship looked like. The interplay of male-female divine, local cult versus centralized power, fringe shrine versus temple. This is the cauldron where Yahweh became elevated, and part of that elevation meant dropping the goddess. Let's be blunt, if Yahweh once had a goddess beside him, then monotheism doesn't look like a simple revelation, it looks like a takeover. A takeover of cult space, liturgy, theology, identity. The inscriptions at Cantilit Ajrud capture a moment in transition. The and his Asherah phrase is the cliffhanger, Yahweh and his Asherah, then monotheism wins, the and his Asherah disappears, the formula shifts, the goddess fades. It's not just religious change, it's suppression and redaction. Now let's zoom in on the human dimension, those who worshipped in that shrine. They were not clerics in Jerusalem. They were travelers, border dwellers, people encountering gods on trade routes, mixing traditions, borrowing language, linking identities. Their blessing formula, I bless you by Yahweh of Samaria and his Asherah, inscribes geography, Samaria, and theology, Yahweh and Asherah, together. That handshake of place and divine couple tells us local identity mattered, pairings of deity in culture mattered, not just abstract monotheism. Some respond, well, maybe it was just an object, a tree pole, not a goddess. True, some scholars argue Asherah might refer to a cultic tree pole rather than a goddess, an Asherah object. Yet, even if you accept that reading, it still indicates Yahweh was worshipped with something else, not alone. The something else may have roots in goddess symbolism or cult objects, but either way, it undermines the notion of exclusive worship. If you're paying attention, this means part of the hidden history of Yahweh worship is about female divine presence, about couples, about shared cult, about diversity of belief before the official version took over. And what's wild is, the popular version didn't die quietly, it was written over, edited out, relegated to archaeology. The jars at Cantilit and Ajrud are like the last hidden pages of a lost chapter. How Yahweh climbed to the top of a divine hierarchy that once looked more like a corporate boardroom than a throne in heaven. And no, this isn't heresy. This is history stripped of its theological makeup. Picture ancient Canaan, a pantheon of gods, each with a portfolio. El, the father of the gods, the elder CEO of creation. Bul, the storm god, the charismatic operations manager who brings rain and fertility. Asherah, the divine mother, partner of El, running the nurturing department. And then you've got Yahweh, just another regional executive in a crowded divine marketplace. But something happens. Somehow, Yahweh hijacks the board. The oldest Israelite religion didn't deny the other gods existed, it simply declared that Israel's God was Yahweh. That's the pivot point that the official texts later sanitize. Early Israelites were henotheists, not monotheists. They worshipped one God without denying others existed. When you read those early inscriptions and songs carefully, the picture is blatant. Who is like you among the gods, O Yahweh? That line makes zero sense if there weren't other gods in the running. The divine council was real. Yahweh wasn't alone. Now, imagine the political stakes. You've got tribes fighting for survival, scattered over hills, with local shrines and regional cults. Each village had its own high place, its own priest, its own mini-deity brand. Then comes the unification under the Yahweh-only movement, which decides to bulldoze this entire ecosystem of divinities and replace it with one monopoly god. That's not revelation. That's a hostile corporate takeover. Let's talk about El, the top dog in the Canaanite pantheon. His name literally means God. You find him across Ugaritic tablets as the elder creator, the father of gods and humans. He's not a mythic nobody, he's the original sky patriarch. And here's the twist, the Israelites didn't start by rejecting El. They merged him. They fused El with Yahweh. They took the authority, the titles, the mythology of El, El Elyon, El Shaddai, and repackaged them under the Yahweh brand. That's theological rebranding at its finest. Yahweh absorbs El, wears his crown, and suddenly the top god of Canaan becomes the exclusive god of Israel. Now, what about Bul, the storm god? He was the rock star of the region, lightning, thunder, rain, the bringer of fertility. His cult was strong, especially among farmers and city-states. But Yahweh's propaganda team learned fast. They took Bul's iconography, the cloud rider, the thunder voice, the wielder of lightning, and gave it to Yahweh. The Lord rides on the clouds. Sound familiar? That's Bul's title, stolen word for word. In the process, Yahweh becomes the jealous monopolist. Bul's temples get smashed, his priests get hunted, and his mythology gets recycled into Yahweh's resume. There's a nasty brilliance to it. You don't erase your competitors, you cannibalize them. You steal their stories, strip their names, and stamp your own logo on their miracles. It's religious conquest disguised as revelation. And the textual record quietly shows the scars. Open the Hebrew Bible, and you'll find echoes of a divine assembly. God stands in the council of the gods, he judges among the gods. That's Psalm 82. The text doesn't describe a lonely God in a void, it describes a God presiding over a court of other deities, demoting them. You are gods, but you will die like men. That's Yahweh executing a hostile merger, absorbing their power, erasing their individuality, and declaring total sovereignty. Then you hit Deuteronomy 32, and it gets even juicier. The earliest versions say the Most High, Elyon, the same El from Canaanite law, divided the nations according to the number of the sons of God, and Yahweh received Israel as his share. That line alone exposes the ancient setup. Elyon assigns nations to various gods, Yahweh just gets one. Israel. But when monotheism takes over, scribes can't tolerate that hierarchy anymore. Later versions quietly edit sons of God into sons of Israel. Just like that, the whole cosmic council disappears. The corporate ladder gets deleted. Yahweh is now the CEO, the shareholders vanish. You see what's happening? The theology evolves not by enlightenment, but by consolidation. Every rival divine figure, El, Bul, Asherah, Elyon, is either absorbed, rebranded, or deleted. By the time you hit the late prophetic age, Yahweh is alone in the text, but not because he always was. Because everyone else got written out of the minutes. Let's not romanticize it. This wasn't a spiritual awakening, it was a power play, political, theological, ideological. When kingdoms centralize, their gods centralize too. The monarchy of Judah needed a single divine figure to anchor national identity. Fragmented worship means fragmented loyalty. One God means one king, one temple, one priesthood, one bureaucracy. Its governance disguised as faith. The irony? The people didn't instantly buy it. Archaeology keeps finding household idols, local cults, and inscriptions to Yahweh and his Asherah long after the official narrative said they were gone. That means the monopoly took centuries of enforcement. The priests and scribes were rewriting the map of heaven while the villagers still prayed to their regional gods. Yahweh was still fighting for market share in his own territory. When you peel away the layers of redaction, you can see how aggressive the Yahwistic editors were. Early texts preserve cracks of polytheism like fossils in stone. They couldn't erase everything. They could only reframe it. The serpent in Eden, the sons of God in Genesis, the heavenly council in Job, these are the fragments that survived the purge. Little reminders that the ancient world once saw heaven as a network, not a monarchy. Imagine standing in Jerusalem around the 7th century BCE. The city smells of smoke, incense, and politics. Priests in white robes march through the courtyards of the temple while royal messengers run orders from the palace. Every hill around you once had an altar, every village a shrine, every family a small figurine of their local deity. But now, all of that is being wiped clean. You're watching a religious purge wrapped in the language of holiness. That's what the so-called reform really was, a centralization campaign, a total religious lockdown engineered by kings and priests who wanted control of minds, money, and mythology. The Deuteronomistic reform under King Josiah wasn't about spiritual purity. It was about monopoly. Before this campaign, Israelite religion was decentralized, multiple sanctuaries, regional priests, hundreds of micro-cultures, each worshipping Yahweh in their own flavor, sometimes with local gods alongside him. Josiah's court didn't like that. They needed one God, one temple, one tax system, one ideological authority. So they staged what looked like a divine audit but functioned like a state coup. They called it reform. In modern terms, it was rebranding. You can almost hear the sarcasm in the Book of the Laws suddenly discovered in the temple right when Josiah needed legitimacy. Convenient, isn't it? A lost scroll appears, declaring that worship outside Jerusalem is illegal, that every high place must be destroyed, and that every other priest now works under the temple establishment. That's not revelation, that's legislation disguised as revelation. The text becomes policy, and policy becomes dogma. Every shrine torn down wasn't just a blow to idolatry, it was a blow to decentralization. Now, let's talk numbers. Hundreds of rural sanctuaries were dismantled. Archaeology shows shrines like Orod and Beersheba abruptly decommissioned. You find smashed altars, broken pillars, defaced figurines. The countryside went dark while the capital glowed brighter. The reformers justified it as purity of worship. What it really meant, everything sacred now had to pass through Jerusalem. If you wanted to sacrifice, you paid temple tax. If you wanted forgiveness, you brought offerings to the city. If you wanted to speak to God, you spoke through their priests. Religion became a pipeline, and they owned every valve. This is the moment Yahweh stops being a local god among many and becomes a national god with a royal army. Theology fuses with politics. The priests start rewriting history. They portray earlier kings who tolerated multiple shrines as villains. They rewrite Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles to make every reformer a hero and every tolerant ruler a sinner. The Bible's narrative gets built around this agenda. Everything is graded by one criterion: did they destroy the high places? That's the new metric of righteousness. You're not judged by justice or wisdom anymore, only by how effectively you enforce the monopoly of worship. And here's the dark irony: this holy purge was brutal. People lost jobs, families, local identities, ancestral altars. Generations who prayed on their village hilltops were branded heretics overnight. Priests from rural sanctuaries were hauled to Jerusalem, stripped of autonomy, turned into temple employees. The divine went from accessible to bureaucratic. Spirituality became paperwork. The gods of the people were replaced by the god of the capital. That's not faith, it's administration. Now look at how the language of fear works. The Reform texts weaponize divine threats. If you worship anywhere else, Yahweh will destroy you. That's the rhetoric of control. Fear replaces devotion. When you scare the population into obedience, you don't need armies, you just need prophets on payroll. And those prophets? They started aligning their visions conveniently with the palace agenda. Every oracle about returning to Yahweh translates to return to Jerusalem. That's how theology morphs into propaganda. Archaeological finds tell us something the official text doesn't. Even decades after Josiah's reform, people kept their household idols. Clay figurines of goddesses still turn up in homes, showing that the public didn't fully buy the state's purity campaign. They obeyed in public, worshipped in private. It's the oldest story of forced orthodoxy, compliance on the surface, rebellion underneath. Monotheism didn't win because it inspired, it won because it outlawed alternatives. The rhetoric of the time was vicious. The writers of Deuteronomy and Kings didn't just outlaw rival cults, they demonized them. Every local deity became the abomination, every rural altar became sin. That's how you erase culture, you label it evil. The word idolatry itself becomes a political slur. You destroy your competition by moralizing them out of existence. The reformers weren't cleansing spirituality, they were cleansing diversity. The temple in Jerusalem becomes not just a house of God but the national treasury. Pilgrimage replaces local ritual. You travel miles, pay dues, feed the system. And with every coin that clinks on the altar, power centralizes. The king can now claim divine endorsement for policy. The priests can claim divine monopoly for interpretation. Religion becomes the software of empire. When you read Deuteronomy carefully, the obsession with the place where Yahweh will choose to put his name shows this shift in real time. That phrase repeats like propaganda. The place, singular. Not places. Not altars. One location, one bureaucracy, one approved method. They're conditioning a population through repetition. It's psychological warfare dressed in scripture. Even more revealing are the violent acts justified under this banner. The reformers destroy sacred groves, grind idols to dust, slaughter rival priests. The propaganda frames it as zeal for purity. But look closer, every act of destruction also happens to eliminate a competing power structure. The priests of Baal weren't just heretics, they were rival clergy with influence and wealth. When you annihilate them, you don't just defend doctrine, you consolidate revenue. It's divine capitalism, control the gods, control the income. Notice the language shift, too. The text starts describing Yahweh not as the God of Israel, but as God over all the earth. That's expansionist language. The theology is scaling up. A local storm god becomes a cosmic dictator. The reformers are building a god big enough to match empire. Because once Yahweh is universal, his representatives can claim global jurisdiction. That's how you sanctify conquest. And then there's the literary trick, rewriting old myths to fit the new orthodoxy. Earlier stories that once showed multiple divine beings now get cleaned. Mentions of the council of gods get changed to angels or metaphors. References to Asherah vanish. The editors retroactively insert monotheism into a past that never had it. It's like editing a nation's history book to pretend there was never opposition. That's not revelation, that's revisionism. By the end of the 7th century BCE, the theological landscape looks completely different. The rural cults are gone, Yahweh is enthroned in Jerusalem alone, and the written word replaces the oral tradition. Literacy becomes a weapon of control. The priests own the scrolls, the people don't. The voice of God is no longer heard in caves or hills, it's read from scripts approved by elites. The God of the poor shepherds becomes the property of scribes. When the Babylonians burned Jerusalem in 586 BCE, they didn't just destroy a city, they detonated the illusion that Yahweh was invincible. His temple was gone, his chosen nation enslaved, his promises shredded. The people who thought their God ruled history were now property in a foreign empire. That's the trauma that gave birth to the sharpest mutation in religious thought. Monotheism turned absolute. Out of humiliation came theology, and that theology became totalitarian. Let's make this clear: the Babylonian exile was the factory floor of divine re-engineering. Before the exile, Yahweh had competitors; after it, he had none. The shift didn't come from revelation, it came from crisis management. When a God loses his house, his city, and his people, the only way to save him is to rewrite the definition of godhood itself. The priests and scribes who survived exile didn't abandon Yahweh, they supercharged him. They made him omnipotent, omnipresent, unchallengeable, because if he wasn't, then everything they built was a lie. That's where the anonymous voice of 2nd Isaiah comes in. Suddenly you hear declarations that feel manic in their certainty: I am the first and the last, besides me there is no God. It's not worship, it's damage control. This isn't a God speaking from confidence, it's a God shouting over doubt. The repetition, the absolutes, the no other God besides me, those are the lines of a deity under reconstruction, a religion rebuilding its shattered psyche. But here's the brilliance: they didn't just claim Yahweh was still powerful. They rewrote the catastrophe itself as part of his plan. The exile stopped being proof of his weakness and became evidence of his control. He used Babylon to punish us. That's the spin. Yahweh didn't lose to the Babylonians, he hired them. The empire that crushed his temple suddenly became his tool. It's the theological equivalent of Stockholm Syndrome, or worshipping your captor by merging him with your God. This is also the era where evil gets institutionalized. Before exile, evil was just misfortune, the work of rival gods or chaos. After exile, every disaster gets tied directly to Yahweh's will. Nothing happens without his command. The theology becomes airtight: you can't blame another deity, you can't blame fate, you can only blame yourself. If the city burns, you sinned. If you're enslaved, you disobeyed. It's genius in its cruelty, total control through guilt. Every calamity becomes divine punishment. Every pain becomes proof of his authority. And because the people are scattered, they can't rely on temple ritual anymore. The priesthood shifts from sacrifice to scripture. The scroll replaces the altar. Faith becomes literacy, and control moves from the knife to the pen. The new priests are scribes, and their weapon is editing. In Babylon, they gather fragments, old hymns, and regional myths, then hammer them into a single story: one God, one people, one destiny. The text becomes their portable temple. Yahweh doesn't need a building anymore, he lives in their rewritten history. Watch how this works psychologically. You're in exile. You're powerless. Everything you believed collapsed. How do you keep believing? You turn powerlessness into prophecy. You write that it was supposed to happen. You tell your people that destruction was part of a cosmic script. That's how the new theology immunizes itself. Doubt becomes devotion. The loss becomes lesson. The more Yahweh fails in history, the more absolute he becomes in theory. The Babylonian gods were physical. They had statues, temples, rituals. Yahweh's priests respond by going abstract. Their God becomes invisible, omnipresent, beyond image or form. The trauma of exile erases his body and replaces it with ideology. You can't destroy an invisible God. You can't capture him, burn him, or dethrone him. The new Yahweh transcends defeat by existing outside the battlefield. That's not evolution, it's survival instinct disguised as theology. And notice the language shift. The older texts talk about Yahweh's anger, regret, jealousy, human emotions. Post-exile, those emotions are reinterpreted as metaphors. The God becomes emotionless perfection. The rough edges vanish because the system can't afford weakness anymore. Yahweh isn't allowed to feel human pain, he becomes divine logic. The priests engineer a personality reboot. The God who once argued, bargained, and regretted now issues decrees like law code. The intimacy disappears. What remains is authority. Then comes the hammer blow, the collapse of divine pluralism. The prophets stop speaking of other gods. They start calling them idols, nothing, false. It's not enough for Yahweh to be supreme, he must be alone. That's a psychological necessity after exile. The idea of multiple gods implies vulnerability, competition, risk. And this people had seen enough defeat to know that competition meant disaster. So they erase it. Reality gets rewritten into a single narrative of divine dictatorship. This also creates a paradox. When Yahweh becomes the only God, he also becomes responsible for everything, good and evil alike. And that's exactly what Isaiah 45 admits: I form light and create darkness, I make peace and create evil. That line is chilling. There's no devil yet, no cosmic scapegoat. The same God who blesses also destroys. That's not holiness, that's totalitarian theology. A God who micromanages morality by owning both sides of it. The worshipper can't escape him even in suffering. By the time the exiles return, the theology is complete. Yahweh has transformed from a territorial deity to a universal one. The trauma has crystallized into monotheistic obsession. And when they rebuild the temple, it's not the same religion anymore. The priesthood is stricter. The texts are curated. The festivals rewritten. The memory of older gods is obliterated. They don't just rebuild a city, they build a mental fortress. Inside it, Yahweh reigns alone, and every rival thought is heresy. And the language of that new Yahweh is bureaucratic perfection. He's described as Lord of Hosts, a military title. The celestial court is gone, but the hierarchy remains. Angels become his administrators, his enforcers. Heaven becomes an empire mirroring Babylon itself. The conqueror's model of governance gets internalized. The people build the same empire that enslaved them, but now under divine branding. Yahweh doesn't overthrow Babylon, he becomes it. That's the hidden brutality of this transformation. A once regional God absorbs the logic of empire, the machinery of control, the psychology of domination. The covenant becomes contract law. The commandments become policy. Faith becomes surveillance. The God of liberation turns into the God of order. And all of it begins in the trauma of exile, when powerlessness had to be rewritten as destiny, when defeat had to masquerade as divine design. After Babylon fell, everything shifted again. The Jews who returned to their homeland weren't the same people who had been taken away. They came back with new theology, new hierarchy, new texts, and a new political reality. The Persian Empire ruled the region now, and its system of control wasn't by sword, it was by policy. The Persians didn't erase local religions, they managed them. They allowed exiled nations to rebuild their temples as long as they remained loyal to the empire. And right there, inside that imperial strategy, Yahweh's cult was reborn. The rebuilt temple wasn't a revival, it was a controlled project. The priests who oversaw it didn't just reconstruct stone walls, they reconstructed theology to fit the imperial mold. Under Persian oversight, Judea became a temple state, and the priesthood became government officials. Religion and politics fused into one administrative body. Yahweh wasn't just the God of Israel anymore, he became the symbol of Persian-approved order. His worship was nationalized. His image standardized. His law politicized. The empire didn't have to dictate doctrine, it only needed to approve which version of Yahweh served their structure. Look closely at the Persian system. Every province had its local god, but all gods ultimately served Ahura Mazda, the supreme deity of Persian Zoroastrianism. That's where the next transformation happens. The Yahweh that emerges from the post-exilic period begins to look and sound like Ahura Mazda, cosmic, moral, transcendent, commander of angels and armies, lord of good versus evil. The dualistic moral framework that dominates later Jewish and Christian texts takes root right here. The Persian influence wasn't minor, it rewired the theology completely. Concepts like angels, demons, cosmic judgment, and the hierarchy of heaven mirror Zoroastrian cosmology. The structure of divine bureaucracy, archangels, heavenly scribes, judgment after death, becomes the new metaphysical order. The scribes who edited the texts during this era weren't writing from prophetic visions, they were systematizing theology to match a world ruled by empires. The result was codified religion, a God that no longer speaks in thunderstorms or fire, but through law, ritual, and priestly decree. Yahweh becomes predictable, calculable, standardized, he fits into the bureaucracy. The priesthood now determines who can speak for him, how sacrifices are made, and who qualifies as pure. The temple is no longer a sanctuary, it's a headquarters. During this time, the Torah is finalized. The 5 books that define Yahweh's authority are edited, compiled, and canonized under Persian administration. The scribes, led by priestly elites like Ezra, take centuries of oral traditions, fragmented scrolls, and regional myths and sculpt them into one linear narrative. The creation, the flood, the patriarchs, the law, all of it rearranged into a coherent theological blueprint. The purpose isn't just to preserve memory, it's to legitimize priestly power. The law becomes divine constitution. Break it, and you're not just disobedient, you're a traitor to both God and state. Ezra's reforms turn the priesthood into the ruling class. The high priest becomes the highest political authority under Persia, governing local affairs on behalf of the empire. The priests decide purity, inheritance, marriage, identity, and citizenship. Yahweh's covenant transforms from a spiritual bond to a bureaucratic contract. It's written, signed, and enforceable through temple law. The faith that once lived in tribal freedom now functions like a legal department of empire. The people are told that obedience equals holiness and holiness equals loyalty. The hierarchy is complete. Archaeological evidence shows the continuity of Persian influence even in script. The Aramaic language becomes dominant, the same language used in Persian administration. Legal documents, letters, and decrees in the Bible mirror the format of Persian bureaucratic texts. The tone of Yahweh's voice in later writings even carries the cadence of imperial authority. He speaks like a monarch, commands like a governor, judges like a lawgiver. The God who once walked among shepherds now issues edicts from the top of a celestial court. Outside of Jerusalem, the story diverges. At Elephantine in Egypt, a Jewish military colony builds a temple to Yahweh, but not to the new version defined by the Jerusalem priests. Their texts and letters still refer to Yahweh and the gods. Plural. They still sacrifice with their own rituals, still use older names and formulas. That shows the split clearly. One faction of Yahweh worshippers aligned with the new priestly orthodoxy under Persia, and another preserved the pre-reform pluralistic traditions. The Persian-backed theology wins, not because it was more true, but because it was more useful. It centralized control and erased dissent. The Persian model also brings cosmic bureaucracy into theology. Heaven becomes organized like an empire. Yahweh rules as supreme authority, surrounded by angelic administrators, Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, the divine equivalents of governors and generals. The world becomes divided between forces of light and darkness, order and chaos, loyalty and rebellion. This wasn't ancient Hebrew cosmology, it's Zoroastrian metaphysics imported through imperial contact. It worked because it justified everything the new priests needed to enforce: purity, hierarchy, obedience. Prophecy changes too. In the pre-exilic era, prophets attacked kings and priests for corruption. In the post-exilic world, prophecy becomes state-approved. The scribes turn the prophets of the past into historical symbols. They are canonized as voices of warning that now justify priestly authority. Their raw rage gets tamed into moral lessons. Real prophets disappear, edited prophets remain. Revelation is archived. The voice of God gets trapped in parchment, locked inside the canon. The theological consequences are massive. By the end of the Persian period, Yahweh is not just one God among many, he's the only legitimate source of moral order in the universe. Every rival belief is either demonized or absorbed. The divine council is replaced with a heavenly bureaucracy. The goddess Asherah is erased. The older pantheon becomes mythologized as false gods. The rewriting is surgical, precise, and absolute. What began as survival after exile becomes dominance through theology. The Persian Empire falls, but the system stays. When the Greeks arrive, they inherit a fully centralized, text-based religion that can survive conquest. The priests don't need armies anymore, they have scrolls. They can outlast empires because their God is no longer confined to geography. Yahweh has been transformed into an imperial God who doesn't need walls or kings. He exists through law, through writing, through hierarchy. The concept of divinity itself is institutionalized. This transformation creates the foundation for every later monotheistic empire. The Christian and Islamic frameworks of divine law, angelic hierarchy, and absolute moral order trace their roots back to this Persian-Jewish synthesis. The Yahweh of the post-exilic world isn't the God of Mount Sinai or the stormy desert. He's a reconstructed version engineered to survive under imperial logic. The language of covenant becomes law. The language of faith becomes obedience. Religion evolves from rebellion into regulation. That's the final stage of Yahweh's metamorphosis, from a regional tribal deity to the supreme architect of monotheism. A God once born in the dust of nomads becomes the cornerstone of civilization itself, polished, centralized, and weaponized by empire. By the time Alexander's armies march through the Near East, the script is already written. The God who once fought for survival now rules through ideology. He doesn't conquer with thunder, he conquers with order. This was the end of the evolution that started in the desert and ended in bureaucracy. The divine went from plural to singular, from local to universal, from personal to political. And once that transformation was complete, the world would never escape the shadow of that system again. Thank you for watching, for listening closely, and for staying with me through this deep dive into the buried architecture of belief. History doesn't lie, it only waits to be read correctly. I appreciate every one of you who made it to the end of this episode. Stay curious, stay sharp, and I'll see you in the next one.